I just want to sort of set the context of this panel. One of the things that Kia and John talked about is having semiconductor manufacturing in places that may not be that friendly to the US. That really begs a lot of questions about what's really happening in the world as it stands today. You know, we're coming off of an extended period, 15 plus years of practically zero cost capital, supreme growth. Everybody was getting funded. Startups couldn't really, get enough of the market, and people were quiet quitting. And it's amazing how so quickly, from quiet quitting, we've become loud working because people are looking for jobs. They're trying to make sure that they don't get fired because they're invincible or invisible in offices. So I think this is the environment we're in. Things are changing. And on top of it, the crazy balloons flying around, and we are also wondering what the hell is going on with China. And to put it more profoundly, I think coming out of COVID, we've all seen the need for a very urgent alternate supply chain infrastructure. And it's in this context by itself, combined with the journey that Indian ecosystem has had over the last 20, 30 years, it presents sort of a very interesting opportunity for the US to look at the Indian market in a slightly different way. Is India an interesting place for deep tech? Is India capable of really addressing the supply chain constraints that we have at a global level? Are we ready to sort of believe in the governance and compliance and transparency issues that are prevalent in many of the emerging markets? So it's in this context that we wanted to have this panel, and we have some pretty amazing people in this panel, and we wanted to give you a sense of how someone who heads up the World Bank would look at global macroeconomic situations and what are the real constraints and opportunities and concerns that a large organization like IMF or World Bank might have, in conjunction with someone who actually on the ground is looking at funding large infrastructure projects in India, and overlay on top of that a very prominent scientist and our own dear Professor Paulraj, who is a professor who's been very actively involved in the Indian ecosystem, to have a conversation. And to actually do this, we couldn't find a better person than our own managing partner, Arun Kumar, who many of you know. Until recently, he was the chairman CEO of KPMG in India, and prior to that, he was with the Obama administrations as the Undersecretary of Commerce and Trade, and as someone just remarked, everybody makes mistakes. So that notwithstanding, please join me in welcoming Arun Kumar to come on the stage and invite his panelists.
Oh, not yet, Prof.
So good morning, everybody. So that was a great conversation with John Hennessy on the new frontier of artificial intelligence. We're going to take you to another frontier, which Sriram alluded to, the frontier of India, and what's going to happen with India in the whole area of technology, investment, and so forth. First, let me quickly introduce the panelists. So we have in the middle, Dr. Indermit Gill. He's the chief economist of the World Bank and senior vice president for development economics. And he has a broad combination of leadership and practical experience working with governments around the world on macroeconomic imbalances, growth, poverty, institutions, conflict, and climate change. Next, on my left, our own Professor Arogyaswami Paulraj, Professor Emeritus at the Department of Electrical Engineering at Stanford, where he has been since 1993. He is a pioneer of MIMO wireless communication, which all of us use in one way or the other. He's the author of 400 research papers, 2 textbooks, and is a co-inventor of 66 US patents. And he has a litany of honors to his name, including the Marconi Medal and India's 3rd highest civilian award, the Padma Bhushan. So we're really proud to have him with us at Celesta Capital. Finally, Anand Unnikrishnan on the extreme right from where you sit. He's managing partner of Fund of Funds at the National Investment and Infrastructure Fund, the NIIF. This is a quasi-sovereign fund of India, a major experiment of the current government. He has over 20 years of experience across India and Australia in various areas of investment management, finance and consulting. The last 15 years has been in India. So a great panel to really look at things from a global point of view, technology point of view, and an investment on the ground point of view in India. Just to pick up on Sriram's comments, let me make 3 observations. One, first of all, I am very convinced about the opportunity in India. And I saw this when I was in the Obama administration. I had a global role where I had a bureau with presence in 78 countries. And my focus was how do we increase US exports? And looking at that space, it was very clear to me that if you took a 10 to 15-year viewpoint, which is what you have to look at the national level, India was going to be a major player. And it's turned out to be since then. And the second, actually, I thought was ASEAN. Countries like Vietnam and so forth were showing tremendous dynamism. There's no question that in terms of size of the opportunity, size of the prize, India was it. Since then, it's become even more important to the United States strategically, given all the various things happening with China. Then, when I finished the administration, my old firm, KPMG, invited me to go and lead the firm in India, which is very large. KPMG's presence in India is very large. It's the second largest in the KPMG universe, 40,000 people on the ground. And there I happened to got a chance to work with people at all levels, with the government, with business leaders, with entrepreneurs. It just confirmed to me the opportunity that exists in India. The energy that you feel there is just tremendous. It reminds me of the dot-com days. People wanting to go out and do things and take risks and make things happen. I mean, it's really quite amazing. Now, all of this is driven by some good fundamentals. One is talent. The talent in India is very, very strong and getting better all the time. Part of that is because global corporations have large presences in India. Many large US companies, their largest employee presence happens to be in India, in Bangalore or Hyderabad or Gurgaon, places like that. And those folks are motivated by the same thing that motivate people here. After a while, some of them say, why don't I go out and design a chip that I can build a company around, rather than do it within my large company. So we're seeing that there's a good substrate of talent, internationally competent talent, that is available. The second is thanks to government policies and thanks to the efforts of some very bold corporations, digital has become ubiquitous. You find mobile phones everywhere in the country. People are buying vegetables using mobile payments, and various standards have been set up by the government that provide a base for a lot of innovation. So the whole digital and mobile area is ground for a tremendous amount of innovation. The third, and this is less well known, is the advanced manufacturing in India. People have been talking about Make in India, the Indian government has been, but originally sitting in the US, we thought, well, this is a protectionist move. It turns out that India can be very competitive in manufacturing. We're seeing lots of examples of that. I can tell you that when I was sitting in the Department of Commerce, when any country says make in this place, you think that the people are creating new barriers. But in actual fact, what's happening is India is getting very competitive. And we are seeing at Celesta many opportunities in that space. So all of this means that India is moving towards not being a cost play anymore. At one time, it was kind of cost play. You can get the same engineer there for 25% of what you get here. Now, no longer. It may be 85% of what you pay here, or maybe the same. But it is a capabilities play. In a business like technology, which is always talent constrained, India has great potential. The third point I'd make is the US-India relationship is getting stronger. So last year, President Biden and Prime Minister Modi, they set up what's called the US-India Cooperation Agreement on Critical and Emerging Technologies. Then last week, the national security advisors and big teams from both sides came together in Washington to flesh it out. Really, they're talking about building a robust common ecosystem between the two countries, which means a lot, because in advanced technologies, especially when they get strategic, There are various IP issues involved. There are licensing issues involved. And loosening those with India as a trusted partner can really help in many ways in terms of technology innovation. So they're looking at quantum computing, artificial intelligence, and so forth. So the relationship between the two countries in terms of collaboration is getting stronger. And in just sheer economic terms, for example, Apple Computer registered a 45% increase in revenues last year from India. So these are huge numbers. India is becoming a very important element, both economically to corporations and from the government point of view. So overall, I'd say it's a very upbeat story on India. But now let me turn to Indermit, so that you can put this in a global perspective.
Okay, thank you, Arun. Thank you very much, both for that introduction and that useful context setting. First, I want to start with a big thanks to Sriram. I don't know where he is because he insisted that I come here, and I'm very happy that I did. So, I have to start with a qualifier that I really don't know anything about the work most of you do. So I know that I'm going to learn a lot here. But unfortunately, I think that you know a lot about the kind of work that economists like I do. So I'm not sure that I'll tell you anything that you don't already know. But what I will tell you is that it's a topsy-turvy world. So normally speaking, we are used to emerging markets doing things badly and advanced economies doing things well. And it's the other way around now. Normally speaking, or at least until 5 or 6 years ago, we were used to India not doing very well, India having lots of trouble and so on, and the rest of the world doing much better. It's the other way around now, right? So because of all these things, actually things have led to three things. The first is that the economic prospects of the global economy are fragile at best right now and contractionary at worst, right? The second is that, as I said, these patterns actually have been caused by big policy mistakes in the world's largest economies, the US, China, and the Eurozone, right? To oversimplify just a little bit, in the US, it was the result of misdiagnosing inflation. In China, it was the result of misdiagnosing the coronavirus. And in Europe, it was the result of misdiagnosing the energy imperative, right? But all of these things have led to huge mistakes. Now, these mistakes have been recognized and they're being rectified. The trouble is that the nature of these mistakes is such that it takes a while to rectify, right? The problem is that in the meantime, the rest of the world will pay, right? It'll pay in low growth, it'll pay in high prices, and it'll pay in greater uncertainty, okay? Now, the third thing that I do want to say is that policies in most emerging markets outside China and some others like Nigeria and Turkey and others have generally been solid, right? But as I said, they will pay the biggest price now. So in particular, actually, countries like Brazil, Indonesia, and India have actually they've actually managed their economies very well, both fiscally and monetarily. They did not overuse fiscal stimuluses during the last few years. They actually recognized the problems that had to do with inflation and so on, and they started to pull back their monetary stimuluses and all well in time, right? And they didn't take the advice of international organizations like the IMF that was saying spend like hell, spend like hell. They didn't do that, right? But they're getting hit anyway. They're getting hit because poorer countries don't borrow in their own currencies, and some are already in debt distress, and many others will actually get into it. So I'll say a few things about it. So I want to quickly elaborate actually on this one. So in terms of the prospects for this year and next, so excluding China, GDP growth in emerging markets and developing economies is expected to slow down from around almost 4% in 2022 to about 2.7% in 2023. And things are not going to look much better in 2024. Okay? Now, in both in 2023 and 2024, per capita income growth in emerging markets is projected to average less than 3%. And this is a full percentage point lower than what we had got used to between 2010 and 2019. before the coronavirus crisis. And over the next, if you look at the average for 2022, 2023, and 2024, private investment in emerging markets is expected to grow about 3.5% on average. That's about half the rate of the previous 2 decades. So things are not looking particularly good in all this. And by the way, international trade is expected to grow at less than 2%, which is a third of the pace that we were used to between 2010 and 2019. So how will India do in all of this? So conditional on no big and unpleasant surprises, actually quite well, right? So India is expected to grow at around 6% this year and the next. Just to give you a sense of the role of India in the world economy, so until 2021, China actually provided about half of the additional economic output of emerging markets, right? So last year, in 2022, because of zero COVID and so on, this fell to about a third, and India actually did rather well. This year, it'll actually go back to half. So as China rebounds, it'll again provide about half of the economic output of among emerging markets. But then over the next few years, we would actually expect China's growth to actually go back to that share closer to a third rather than half. And we should expect India's share to actually grow. Now, if India does well in attracting investment, this could be India's time. Okay? But again, it depends on what India does. So I can actually continue on this one about about how we see India's investment climate, or
we can come back to that.
Come back to it.
But you made a very important point implied about China as well. In so many areas, the global supply chains are so incredibly concentrated on China, whether it's in pharmaceuticals or in electronics. That is actually creating an opportunity for India to be a trusted partner in global supply chain. So maybe when you come back in the next round,
sure,
we might chat about that. So to Paul.
Thank you, Arun, and thank you, Indermit. So I'm going to focus on technology, but let me make some. Arun didn't mention this, but I've got 5 decades of work behind me, and I spend most of it in India. My stay at Stanford has been relatively short. But looking at India today, I'm very, very optimistic. And one thing is, I do think there's a lot of political consensus on the direction of the country. So whether it's the current government or a new government, the country's business, economic model is well put. They're going to be very stable. So I think that's a big plus. Now, certainly demographic, everybody knows about that. It's a double-edged sword, but I think we can make it into a very positive factor for India. And third, which is, I think Arun mentioned it, the digital India transformation is proving to be very successful. So using the internet, Vint is here, and building fintech type of application on them, we're able to reach to everybody in India in a variety of ways. So that's a huge transformation. So I see these as big things, and there's of course, a lot of investors here, and I think we all now agree that the capital markets in India are very mature. They can do pretty well on their own, and I think the return on equity, earnings growth, all these are very strong. And also, I should mention, going back to John's morning fireside chat about ChatGPT. I belong to Noam Chomsky's crowd, which believes that it's not necessarily the way to general AI, but it's going to make a lot of money and it's going to be very useful. But in the Indian context, I think it offers a huge potential, because only about 10 or 15% of India really understand fluent with English. Most of India are regional languages. And they are cut out of the repository of knowledge that English has in STEM, and science and technology, and industry. And ChatGPT, large language models, can actually do what digital transformation did for India in making this large population, maybe more than 1 billion people, dig into this knowledge base and use it. So I think that's something we should really look at carefully. So with that, let me spend a little bit of time on technology. I know we talk about deep tech is a very flexible word, but what's deep tech in India? In the United States, I would say R&D intensive manufacturing with large markets. So it could be semiconductors, aerospace, particularly, or commercial jets, say Boeing. Semiconductors could be Intel, branded pharma, new molecule pharmaceuticals like Moderna, and advanced instrumentation like applied materials, and certainly software publishing like Microsoft. So these are the crown jewels of advanced economies. And of course, we're now in deep tech also mean moving the frontiers here further, and things like quantum computing or RNA medicine and so on and so forth. And we're trying to address, I think, the real problems of the world in terms of climate change and sustainability. In India, I think the issues are different. In terms of these deep technologies, today India imports all of these things. The actual value added in India, I'm talking about Indian headquartered companies, is pretty small, or negligible. So I think the deep tech in India really is to add indigenous content to technologies of what I mentioned now to add value within India. So we're starting from a very low base, and for a variety of reasons, including the earlier ones, and also strong political will. I've never seen the political will for technology stronger than it is today. I've known India for many years. So coupled with a strong political will, I think there's an enormous opportunity in India for deep tech. And so it's going to be largely, and it's going to be pushed forward. I'll talk more later in the conversation about what we can do as investors, but can be pushed forward certainly by the public policy. So public policy, where I'm now involved with in the semiconductor mission, for example, still needs lots of fine-tuning, but public policy in terms of supporting the growth of deep tech, there's lots of momentum at the political level and the bureaucratic level, I think, are coming along. So this kind of tailwind is going to transform India. So today, if I look at value-added revenue from the gross margin perspective, deep tech of Indian headquartered companies is very, very small. It's about 5 billion or so. While in the United States, if I could be wrong, it's something like 500 billion. And in 10 years, people believe India will be a 10 trillion economy. If we do it right, we can probably get to 100 billion of deep tech value addition in our country, in India. And that means a $1 trillion market, or much more than that. So India, with all its tailwind, is an enormous opportunity for deep tech investments. Thank you.
So thank you, Paul. And you alluded to the capital markets being supportive. You also alluded to how deep tech and manufacturing are connected, as you see it in the United States. Now, we have a very interesting company, just to share, a Celesta portfolio company called IdeaForge that is going to go public, and they've just filed their equivalent of the S1 just last week. And it plays right into the space. Designed, manufactured in India, really advanced technology that combines imaging and aeronautics and navigation and so forth. So Anand, you know the situation on the ground?
Thank you, Arun. Firstly, thank you for having me here. It's great to be here and speak to this audience of accomplished people. So thanks for having me here. I'm just going to pick up on what Professor Paulraj was saying about government policy intent on how we are essentially supporting the startup ecosystem in India. So let's just contextualize this for a moment. 10 years ago, I don't think anyone was talking about startups in India. There was the odd sort of, consumer technology companies. There were platforms like Flipkart, which later got acquired by Walmart. Some of these shopping sites, all of those in India, which were the real, I guess, startup ecosystem at the time. Today, we have over 100 unicorns, right? And unicorns, I know, is a valuation sort of threshold, but large companies that are serving consumers, that are creating employment opportunities, and that are delivering products and services in most parts of the country. So what has led to that change? And I think this is where what Professor Paulraj was saying is actually most applicable. In 2016, the government came up with what we call the Startup India Mission. And the whole idea of the Startup India Mission was to encourage entrepreneurship and innovation in India across 2 or 3 different categories. One was about making it easier to set up a company and easier to wind up a company if that fails. The second was about some tax breaks and tax incentives which channelized people to take risk, which also gave you the probability of a higher return when things worked out. The third, I think, was the most effective, which was creating that partnership between academia, industry, and business. And that is something that India had never seen before. So as a country, we've always sort of used public expenditure for public good in areas of either subsidies or creating infrastructure and areas like those. I think now is the attempt by the government to say, let's partner with industry, let's partner with academia, let's set up innovation labs in the country. And we launched what was called the Atal Innovation Mission at around the same time, 2016, 2017. What that meant is it focused on creating an ecosystem, including things like tinkering labs. So what are tinkering labs? Tinkering labs are essentially labs set up in high schools in India where students can have do-it-yourself kits in areas like IoT, in areas like artificial intelligence, basically experimenting and creating that curiosity among kids so that when these guys get out of school and go into advanced courses, they have a sense of what they can do with technology. I think that was an important step. The goal, like anything in India, is big, right? It's 100,000 tinkering labs that they were to set up in India. Today they have about 10,000. So this was 3 or 4 years ago. They have about 10,000 labs in the country now. The goal is to have 1 million children coming out of these experiences and becoming innovators who will create something very, very unique for India. So that's the goal. The other thing that they've done is, again, from a government policy point of view, is bring together partnerships with companies like Dell, for example. I think Intel has a partnership with India. So that's the sort of corporate partnerships that the government agencies are forming with all of these large companies that can bring in the technical expertise in India. Certain voluntary organizations or charitable organizations like the Bill Gates and Melinda Gates Foundation. There's partnerships with those, and all of this is in the context of driving the entrepreneurial spirit and driving innovation in India. So that's something that they've carried out really well. The other thing that I want to sort of touch upon is what has that done to the startup ecosystem, and what is that doing to deep tech, and what is that doing to an investing landscape, which is what we look at. So roughly today, I think there are about 80,000 startups in India. So in the last 6-7 years, there's been about 80,000 startups, out of which about roughly 5% are deep tech. Now, deep tech, as Professor Paulraj was saying, in India, the concept of deep tech is using new technology to provide services to the last man standing in the country. So from a government point of view, it is how do I deliver services, how do I deliver products to people who wouldn't have access and wouldn't be able to afford a particular product or service. And I think that is the lens that comes through. So when you think about use cases, for example, health is a big use case for deep technology in India. Climate and decarbonization is another big use case. Agri and agri-tech, I think that is a very interesting areas where many companies are doing very interesting work. And one of the companies in your portfolio, Arun, Stellap's, is doing some fantastic work on using IoT devices in the whole dairy ecosystem, right from milking equipment to the chilling plants, etc., which allows an end consumer to be able to trace the quality and trace the origin of where the milk has come from. So some very interesting work being done. Now, having said that, when you look at who's funding the whole startup ecosystem and who's funding deep tech, so there's roughly about 100 VC managers in India, give or take a few of us, roughly about 100. Out of which I think there are two managers who are focused on deep tech. There are some others which also invest in deep tech, but I think with the core focus area of deep tech, there's only 2 managers. Now that gives a lot of opportunities for firms like Celesta to actually leverage of the US-India corridor, to have the US experience of riding through cycles, of riding through innovative business models, bring that into India. So I think that is a huge opportunity for India and for firms like Celesta in India. Over the next decade, I see this growing in a in an exponential manner. In India, nothing goes in a linear manner, right? I mean, we skip sort of a couple of stages, and it's always exponential in growth. And that is, at least in my opinion, that's what's going to happen to the whole deep tech ecosystem as well. I'll pause there for the opening comments, Arun, and hand it back to you.
Yeah, no, it's a great point. You made some really great points. One, if it's not clear to everyone, India's startup ecosystem, including the number of startups, is the second largest in the world today.
That's right.
Very clear. And you've talked about the startup missions. I was actually at the two stars of those entities in the last 2 weeks. One was in Hyderabad called T-Hub, and the other was in Kerala called Kerala Startup Mission. Both very impressive. The second one actually had a maker lab modeled on the MIT's maker lab. And so it was really incredible to see the amount of ideas. You also talked about the fact that things have to be at scale in India. Now, this is a challenge. Capital will be available, but I think entrepreneurs need capital plus the experience to be able to tackle things and succeed at scale, which is very, very important. As you said, when you're dealing with the volumes and the problems in India, you have to think very big. And to get there, it's not just a question of financial capital, it's also the intellectual capital.
Absolutely.
So maybe can I just ask you about the whole ease of doing business?
Yes.
Because the World Bank has promoted the whole metric of ease of doing business. India has taken that very seriously, and where does all that stand?
So we used to do something called the ease of doing business assessments until 2020. And as a result of certain internal problems and so on, we stopped that, and now we're going to actually come up with a better, we are trying to improve the measure, and we're trying to come up with something that will be even more reliable. But I was quite involved in this from the start, and I have to tell you that early on, when I'm talking about years before 2014, India was very busy trying to kill the doing business assessment. Okay? They didn't like it. They were actually doing very poorly in it. So India's rank in the doing business assessment was around 130 out of 190 countries, up to about 139 even at some time. And the Indian government was very busy trying to kill it, okay? Along with the French and a few others, okay? For obvious reasons, as you know. Yeah. But then what happened was you had a change in government in India, and suddenly you got a completely different focus, saying, okay, we have to sort of figure out how to do better, right? And you saw gradual improvement in these things, and then over time, until the last time that we did the doing business assessment was 2020. And at that time, actually, India had gone all the way from 130th to about 63rd or 62nd or something like huge, huge improvements. And if you sort of look at those things a bit more closely, you actually found that India had done rather well in terms of helping small and medium firms in getting electricity, getting credit, getting construction permits, and protecting minority investors. Done incredibly well in all three of these things. It's very important to actually know that it used to be a pain in the ass to get electricity in India. And India did very well in that. India had also made huge improvements in trading across borders and resolving insolvency. Okay, so again, I think. Now, India still had to do a lot better to actually make it easier to start a business, to hire workers, to pay taxes, and to register property and enforce contracts. If you sort of look at these areas, you start to sort of see that it's difficult to improve those last things, because all those things tend to be on the concurrent list of things between states and the central government. So the things over which the central government had more control, you actually made faster progress and so on. So if I had to give India grades for improving the investment climate and so on, I would give it a B. Okay, and I'm giving it a B. So I'm using Stanford grades. I'm not using University of Chicago grades. But because Stanford grades are far more lenient than the University of Chicago. Okay. So I think India gets an A for improving the business climate for men. okay? And India gets a C. Again, I'm being quite lenient here. It gets a C for improving the working conditions of women, right? So if you sort of look at, so all the things that I mentioned to you, those are things that I would call them to be, the things that India has done to improve the doing business indicators, right? But we also have something called women, business, and the law, right? And we do that assessment. If you look at that, so India is in the top third on doing business, and India is on the bottom third on women, business, and the law. So if you look, for example, India's female labor force participation rates are closer to around 20, 25% or something like that. Compare that with China's, which is close to 69, 70%, okay? So India is trying to catch up to China hobbling on one leg, okay? So Indian women tend not to be full participants in the labor force and so on. I guess the analogy that I use is that it's actually because of several reasons. The first reason, I think, is that generally speaking, you find that once you start the agricultural transition, folks move from agriculture into light manufacturing, right? And India has not done too well until recently in light manufacturing. The second thing is that India hasn't done too well, especially northern India has not done too well in ensuring public security for women, especially women, right? So the analogy that I use is that northern India is kind of like a US suburb for men when it comes to security, and it's kind of like a US inner city when it comes to girls and women, right? So for all of those reasons, I think that's the reason why India hasn't done nearly as well as China, I think. But these are things that the government is very well aware of and so on. The other thing, you have to compare India with other countries, especially the US, the Eurozone, and China, is in ensuring a stable macroeconomic environment. And I think India has actually done much better than those countries. I can tell you a little bit more on that one.
So I think Indermit talked a little bit about giving a grade B. So I want to do some more reality check on around two keywords. One is deep tech and investments. Investment opportunity, because the crowd here is that kind of crowd. So firstly, in terms of reality check, India is still very early in advanced R&D ecosystem. For example, I think the World Bank would put in the R&D investments in the United States at $550 billion, and they probably put India at $45 billion. But that's PPP terms. But a lot of R&D is imported, equipment. So we have to go back to exchange rate terms. I think it's probably Indian R&D really is about 20 billion. So it's really only but a small fraction of United States. So the ecosystem we have of research universities, advanced labs, corporate R&D, India doesn't still have that. So we're starting from very small base, but I think that's also the opportunity here for India. So I like to sort of focus on three things I think we have to fix for India to really realize its potential in deep tech. Again, when I say deep tech, I'm talking about stuff like semiconductors, commercial jets, branded pharma, advanced instrumentation, which require lots of R&D and lots of knowledge. So I think there are three things that we need to fix. One is government policy. Certainly at the political level, at the top where I function, there's a lot of will to do that. But to translate that into effective policy is going to take more time. At the political level in any country is not very savvy in technology, but that's fine. At the bureaucratic level, we have very bright administrative officers, but they never understand this industry. So they're mostly sitting in the states. When they come to the center, they have 3 or 4 years, 5 years in the center, but this industry, deep tech industry, is not something they understand. So a lot of the policies that I'm involved with in semiconductors lead to a lot of fine-tuning. So for us, India to really realize its potential in deep tech, I think all of us here who want to invest in India must join the government in some forms or other to improve the policy making, because that is critical. India needs effective policy making, and in my opinion, we need a lot more work to be done there. The second thing I'd like to see is that in terms of talent, India has lots of talent sitting in MNC R&Ds, the Intel and the Qualcomms, extremely superb people, but very difficult to pull, and they can build companies in India, but very difficult to pull them out because they're so well looked after. I did pull out one of my students, and that very quickly became a billion-dollar company, Natrodyne. But in general, I feel that, well, that may also should work. There's lots of potential for moving in people from the US or advanced economies back to India, because India is really the growth area. And so moving people back with technology background, with experience, also business background, to go back and build companies in India. And I think the government of India welcomes that, because that knowledge, if outside the MNC R&Ds, outside that is pretty minimal still, for very good reasons I mentioned. So taking talent back to build really world-class companies in India is also very important. Third thing I would like to say is also in investments. So far, much of the foreign FDI, even for US or from China, has in the area of so-called deep tech would be mostly internet app companies, Zomato or food delivery, certainly some fintech companies too. But in deep tech, we've been very little. Certainly not the Chinese, and very little from United States. Celesta, I think, is one of the pioneers there trying to do things. But we need much more money. I think, I would say, over the next 10 years, we should try and bring in about $50 to $70 billion of deep tech investments. And it's just not money that we can bring from the United States, but also bring in industry knowledge and bring in partnerships. All those things are still very minimal in India. So I think government policy, talent, and smart investments, along with the partnership that US can bring, I think these are the key to success. But I think the potential of these things happen is enormous. And I said again, we can get to about 100 billion of value-added revenue in 10 years. I think it's entirely possible. That'll still be only about 1.5% of the GDP at that time. It's a market cap of $1 trillion. And all that is in front of us.
So Anand, maybe you want to pick up on some of these points about government policy and the regulatory system. Recently, India has been on the news because of the Adani situation. The New York Times actually had a very balanced view on it, saying that don't judge the Indian regulatory system by this one incident. But it may be good to hear from you on your experience in this space.
So let me talk about two things, Arun. One is, so we are 49% owned by the government of India. And like you said in your opening remarks, we are an experiment in whether a PPP framework works in the investment management industry or not. So let me talk about my experience. I've been with NIIF for 5 years. People were very skeptical when NIIF was set up, because it was very, very rare in India for a government to commit at that time $3 billion to a new institution, say that we will only be 49% and 51% comes from global private investors. And some of the investors who backed us in the 51% includes the Canadian Pension Plan, Ontario Teachers Pension Plan, RDR, Temasek, so some big blue chip names. And then once the government has set up the institution, they'll hire a team of professionals, and those professionals will actually make the investment decisions, and government will actually function arm's length from the team, with no role in investment decision making. I don't think many people believed that this would work. And about 6 years in from the time we were set up, I think the model is working. And that itself is so in my experience, dealing with the government, which most of us are skeptical of, is for us has actually been a good experience. We've seen the support, we've seen them listening. We've got a policy advisory team within the institution, and we help the government understand the voice of investors when they come up with any new models, right? So that's what we do. That's the part we play. So it's actually been quite a positive experience in dealing with the government. Look, in terms of governance and Adani, etc. Look, I would say we've got regulators who've done their job for a very long period of time. What we have in this specific instance, without going into the merits or demerits of the case, there are allegations and there are denials, right? And the regulators will do their job. If there is any merit, they will do what they need to do. But as a country, what are we? I mean, 3 weeks ago, we were $1.4 billion consumers. We're still 1.4 billion consumers. We've got a GDP of $3.5 trillion, and that remains the same. We've got a market cap of somewhere between 3 and 3.5 trillion. That remains the same. So I think India is bigger than any particular company or any particular corporate group. So let's just see how that plays out.
Great. No, thank you. I think we've kind of almost come to our time, but I just thought I wanted to call on my partner, Nick. Where is Nick? So Nick, maybe, all of us here are very close to the Indian scene. You are close to it, but at a bit more of a remove than us. And I thought it might be great to hear, your thoughts.
Well, first of all, let me start by saying I'm West Indian, so I'm kind of Indian too.
There you go.
But, Michael and I, when we were at Flextronics, got involved in India back in around 2000s. And back then when we got involved because we felt there was talent in India that can help us build Flextronics. So we didn't go to India primarily for the same reasons others was going, because of labor arbitrage. We were going there for talent. And we built 2 significant hardware businesses there when we were at Flex. One was we started a group that was doing ODM switches, layer 2, layer 3 switches. And then we started another one that was doing set-top boxes. And these became billion-dollar businesses at Flex, and it paid off. And then when I was at Aptina, I started a design center in India, designing CMOS image sensors when I was the CEO there. And again, I went there because of the talent. And the very first chip we asked that team to design worked. And these are complex chips. It wasn't a high-resolution one. We started with low resolution, but the very first chip worked. Again, validating the belief that the talent was there. And since then, that team has grown. Now it's part of ON Semiconductor, and they're designing pretty complex image sensors. When we started Celesta Capital, we made some early investments in India. And there were a couple of things we noticed. One was, in the deep tech space, I would say the entrepreneurs didn't have the level of self-confidence then, 10 years ago, as they have today. Today, the kinds of companies we're seeing and the entrepreneurs are very different. There's a significant increase in the self-confidence of the entrepreneurs, and they're tackling very big problems. Big problems not just in India. Someone mentioned that many of the problems they're tackling are problems related to access, whereas in the developed countries, most people are tackling problems relating to, I would say, more convenience, almost, on the consumer side. And the problems related to access are big problems. They're the problems of the world. They're the problems of the rest of the world, whether you're talking about the medical space or others. And so I really believe that the potential in India for deep tech is just phenomenal. Anything else?
I think that's a great note to...
I just wanted to add a few things. So India's monetary policies have been very good. I think the central bank has done very well on that one. If you look at fiscal policies, I think they've done very well on that one too. When it comes to regulatory policies, I think the general sort of suspicion, or the accusation against India was that we had moved from anti-business policies to pro-business policies. And what you really want is pro-market policies, especially for the tech sector and so on. So I think that whole Adani episode and so on makes people think a little bit about that part, so is the regulatory environment pro-market or is it pro-business? But I think it's a good wake-up call for India to actually move from pro-business to pro-market.
That's a great point. And it's really important that to have a real good market, you've got to have a good regulatory system. So thank you. I want to thank each of the panelists. Thank you for your contributions and perspectives.